Welcome to Agrina Live, Agrina World's Conversation with Expert series. Today we're discussing the upcoming UK-EU referendum vote, which will take place on the 23rd of June. We will be discussing what that might mean for climate change and energy. And with us to discuss this will be Friends of the Earth's Head of Science, Policy and Research, Mike Childs, Stephen Tindale, a former director of Greenpeace UK, who now heads up the Weinberg Next Nuclear Foundation, and scientific director of the Institute of Occupational Medicine, Fintan Hurley. Welcome all. I'll start with you, Stephen. Will a Brexit even matter for our ability to tackle climate change?
It will matter a great deal because climate change is a global problem. One country cannot do enough to tackle it. The UK is responsible for only less than 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The UK actually has a more progressive climate policy than the rest of the EU. In most green areas, the UK is a follower, but on climate change, we are actually something of a leader. So, whereas in most areas, the UK environment would suffer because we wouldn't keep up with the rest of Europe, on climate change, we would be foregoing an opportunity to lead and shape European climate policy.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'll just, Mike or Fintan, do you want to weigh in on this? Mike first.
Well, so the question of the referendum comes in two parts, really, doesn't it? There's a part about has the EU been good for the UK's environment, and as Stephen has just pointed out, you look across a whole range of areas, from river pollution, drinking water quality, acid rain, a whole range of areas. The EU has undoubtedly improved the environmental performance of the UK. The UK has fought tooth and nail against some of these improvements that we've seen, and as a result of being the EU, people's lives and their health and the health of the environment has been improved in the UK. The second part of the question is whether, if we left the EU, our environment would deteriorate or get better. And to that part of the equation, you need to look at the politics and who's making the arguments for the exit side. And when you look at the leaders of that, you see Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, Ian Duncan Smith, and the leaders of the Out campaign have made it very clear they give very little to no priority to looking after the environment. And climate change, they think, is not a serious issue. So the idea that if we left the European Union, we would maintain that status as a leader in climate change is massively open to question. I think all the evidence suggests that actually we would not only forego a chance of leading the European Union, as Stephen said, but actually climate policy in the UK could take a very serious step backwards. So whatever way you look at it, the EU have been better for us in the last decades in terms of improving our environment, and undoubtedly if we leave our environment, including on climate change, will be a lot worse if we leave as well.
Fintan, is the EU doing anything in tackling climate change and protect our environment?
Well, I think there's already some agreement, it mightn't sound like it, between Stephen and Mike, and that is that the issues are international issues. They can't be tackled by a single country successfully. My own area is air pollution and health, and that's very much the case there too. The evidence is international. Air pollution travels, so the solutions need coordination. I think both Mike and Stephen have said that in most areas of environment, then it's been helpful for the protection of UK citizens and the environment to be part of the EU, because the EU has moved forward things which would not have moved forward here otherwise. Now, Mike made an important point, and I'm not strictly competent, and sorry, but Stephen made an important point, and I'm not strictly competent to be able to comment on it, but The question is whether, if we are leading on climate change, and I don't know if we are, I'm sure Mike will have a view on that that's better informed than mine, whether we can lead in Europe better from outside the Union rather than from within it. And my understanding of EU legislation is that it sets minimum requirements on a lot of things, but any participating country can do better if it wants to. So I don't think that being in the EU is a block to progress for countries that want to lead and take initiative. I'd say one final thing, if I may, at this point. I mean, I'm a scientist, I work in a research institute. Some of our funding comes from the EU research programme. It's true of many organisations in the UK. It's not just a self-interest thing that I'm pointing this out, that we would need continued access to this, but it's important for the science and the evidence base that we can continue to have easy collaboration with colleagues in Europe as well as elsewhere.
And Fintan, if we just briefly stay with you, and obviously on the issue of on air pollution, if you take for UK perspective, who will make sure that we deal with air pollution if we didn't have EU to come after UK? Because the UK government have not put forward any kind of clean targets on air pollution. It's all come from the EU, who's been chasing them up and who's been imposing fines on London because they have failed to comply. Do you think a UK government would be able to comply with the right standards without having the EU to set targets for them?
Well, I'm quite close to the scientists, say in the Department of Health or Public Health England or in DEFRA, and I trust them. I mean, I trust their ability and I trust their commitment to public health and to the environment. But we're operating in a society in the UK and actually in Europe where there's a reining back on willingness to commit to the changes that need to be made in terms of the environment generally, climate change, air pollution, because it's seen to be a restriction on business. And my personal view, not necessarily my organization's view, but my personal view is with Mike there. When I see who is leading on the move to leave the EU, it's very difficult to have trust that they're going to make things better in terms of environmental protection and public health. I think it was last evening that Nicola Sturgeon said, you know, there are problems, but maybe it's the way we're running our economy that's causing them. Maybe it's not the legislation that tries to protect human health and the environment.
I think Stephen, that's an important point, is that obviously while we don't have trust in the current UK government to do better, there's also other arguments coming from the fact that they think there's actually deregulation process happening in the EU kind of thing, and it's actually turning more away from the previous kind of climate commitments, and they're not. It's been watered down, and you see that in the TTIP. What's your view on that?
Well, before I come to TTIP, I completely agree that the key issue here is not the constitutional arrangements, it's the politics. Outside the EU, yes, we could impose these laws on ourselves. The question is whether we would. And Zach Goldsmith, when he was running to be Mayor of London, he said basically we could become like Norway. Well, we could, if we had a sovereign wealth fund, which unfortunately we forgot to create. We could if we had a cultural transformation in the UK, and most of our citizens and all of our politicians became completely different and more Norwegian. That is not very likely anytime soon. So I think if we leave the EU, the UK will return to being the dirty man of Europe as we were before we joined. Now, on TTIP, I think this is not a referendum on TTIP. TTIP has not been agreed, and if it is agreed, then it will have to be then signed up to by all the national governments as well as by the European Commission and the European Parliament. So those who are concerned about TTIP, and I include myself in that, that is not a reason to vote against the EU. And Friends of the Earth, I commend Friends of the Earth for having made that very clear. They have been very concerned campaigning on TTIP, but have said, nevertheless, we want to remain in the EU.
And, well, Mike, do you, I guess you want to comment on that, but can I also add before you comment is that you were clear that the evidence would be that green groups like Friends of the Earth, like Greenpeace, quite early in the beginning came out in favor for staying, but you have other groups like WWF and RSPB and the Nature Trust who I think, believe it or not, come out now, but it took them a long time, so there has been some hesitance on the green side, haven't there?
So very briefly on TTIP, thank you for mentioning congratulations, Stephen. It's right. We had TTIP is a different matter, and anyway, even if we left the EU, the UK has been a flag waver to TTIP and would be walking around the world with a begging bowl to get trade deals signed with anybody. So the rest of the EU may well reject TTIP in the fullness of time. I suspect we would run to America and sign whatever piece of paper they gave us because we're doing very weak states. So I think if you're against TTIP, it's probably better to battle that within the European Union. In terms of, yes, Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, and actually the Wildlife Trust came out very early with a clear position on the EU. The other big nature groups, RSPB and WWF, took longer to get there, not because they don't think the evidence is strong, and they clearly have now come on board, just because each charity has different trustees, it has a different membership base. They had to do more work to make sure that their trustees and membership base were happy with the evidence before they could then come out publicly, and now they have come out publicly. So we've got a unity across green groups that says actually it's much less risky to the environment if we stay in the EU. Leaving the EU would be incredibly risky for the environment. So that unity ought to give anybody who's interested in the environment, environmental protection, and the future well-being of current and future generations a clear signal that when going in the ballot booth on the 23rd of June, to put your cross next to Remain if you want to protect the things we all cherish.
Yeah, thank you for that. And if I can start with Fintan, do you think that environment, climate change, air pollution, like say, has that featured high up enough up the list on the EU opposition campaign, or has it been kind of slightly missing?
I want to answer that, but I would also like to say that from the public health point of view, TTIP is a worry because it seems that it might inhibit legislation, really good and useful legislation to protect public health. And I agree with the others that it's going to be an issue, or an equivalent of it is going to be an issue, whether the UK is within Europe or not. I think that the issue of climate change is one of the big issues of our time. I think it's going to outlive me. I think it's going to be part of the framework of the rest of my life. My professional work is in what I'll call an adjacent area of air pollution and health. I think it's really important that we look at the two of them together, because for some people still climate change seems like a distant thing, distant in space, affecting communities far from here that we can perhaps think we can afford to forget, and affecting people forward in time. But right here and now, air pollution kills, best recent estimate, about 40,000 people a year in the UK, maybe 10 times as much as that across Europe. It's got an immediate impact. And I think if we put the two together, quite often we see the same sources, what we call dirty energy, kinds of transport and so on, cause or contribute to both areas. So I think we do need to build a broad coalition, and a bigger coalition and a better coalition to fight for protection of the environment and human health, and that we need to do that whether the UK is within Europe or outside of it. I don't think we can say, I don't think we can trust the current arrangements in either place to deliver what's needed.
Stephen, has the climate change and environment had the feature line up of on the list on the EU referendum debate?
Well, not for me, but that's not surprising because I'm a full-time Green campaigner, so obviously I would like more. I think air pollution is also an issue that is missing, and as has just been said, they are linked issues. The Lancet Commission on Climate Change last year did a report which showed that there were significant, what they call co-benefits from reducing the use of coal in power stations and the use of oil in transport, and those co-benefits would be many fewer people dying from air pollution. That's pretty substantial. And because the EU has a good track record on air pollution, not good enough, could be better, needs reform, that needs to be stressed the whole time. The EU is not perfect, but what is? So the EU, given all the constraints, has not done badly on improving air quality, and that is part of a positive, inspiring message for European cooperation, rather than the doom and gloom and the scare stories, which are necessary to say this would be the result of leaving, but are probably not enough to inspire people, particularly young people, who we desperately need to go and vote for Remain.
Mike?
So, Stephen's right, the EU has been a positive force in a whole range of different areas, and the pictures of when much of the forestry within Scandinavia, Germany and Eastern Europe is being decimated by UK pollution are stories of the past, and that's the EU that's largely doing that. So that does give a positive story that countries coming together can solve issues. Is the EU doing enough? Well, the EU is doing a good job, but I think when one looks at the science and the challenges we have ahead of us on climate change and a whole range of different things, we need a very significant step change within Europe and the rest of the globe to tackle these issues if we can prevent the injustices and the damage to our ecosystem services and the nature that helps us thrive. So there's a good news story out there, but yes, as campaigners, we need everybody to keep on pushing hard and fighting hard, and scientists push on that angle as well, because we've got a long way to go. But we're not going to do it if we break up and become isolationists. The only way we can solve these challenges is to come together and step up to the plate together and work together. And that's the vision of Europe we have, not one that's fixated on growth and economic prosperity alone. It's got to be on securing a healthier, prosperity for us and nature as we go forward.
I would
thank you. Go on.
Anders, may I add? I mean, it's easy to speak of the EU as if it were monolithic here and had just one voice. My experience of working with the policymakers in DG Environment, especially a little over 10 years ago on the Clean Air for Europe program, where I was involved in the scientific team linked with that, is that DG Environment wanted really quite strict standards, much stricter than were eventually agreed. They had to negotiate with other directorates like Transport, Energy, and I think especially Enterprise, which looks after what it sees as the well-being of companies. And then a commission watered down policy had to go through the member states and the parliament. And I think quite often it is the member states that put a brake on things. So we have to, in thinking about improving EU policy, we have to, I think, differentiate where the pinch points are, where are the places where the blockages are, where are the places where there's momentum, and there are multiple opportunities to tone down what might originally start as quite ambitious legislation. And that really then needs popular movements in the countries to try to make sure that good legislation happens and is enforced.
Can I just add to that?
Actually, let's come to you, Stephen, because I'm going to let you have the last word because we're nearly out of time.
Okay, thank you. Well, no real disagreement between the three of us, but yes, it's frustrating when things get blocked by the Council of Ministers, but they are the democratically elected governments.
Yes.
All this nonsense about stuff being imposed by Brussels bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats, is nonsense, because all the Commission can do is propose. The only people who can make things law are elected, either the Council of Ministers, the national governments, or the European Parliament, who are directly elected. So the idea that just sweeping away Brussels would suddenly restore democracy is complete, what was John Major's word, codswallop. So the national movements to persuade elected politicians to be more ambitious, to be more protective of public health, to be more science-based in terms of climate, they are absolutely needed. And on the 24th of June, if we voted to stay in the EU, which I desperately hope we will have done, that is going to be where I put all my effort, and I'm sure Mike and other campaigners will be doing the same, as long as we stay in. If we don't stay in, we have an enormous problem, and God knows what we'll do next.
Well, that's a very point I can't point to finish it on, and thanks you all for taking part, and I'm sure the discussion will carry on just up until the 23rd and the 24th. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anders.